And I think we might be good to go, David. So I'm going to pass it off to Dr. David Yoakum.
Thanks, Ryan, and welcome everybody. I'm David Yoakum, the Director of Policy Lab at Brown University. I'm very excited to be here with Jenny Owen and Jason Coupe to be talking about how to start strong with research government partnerships. And in a second, we'll go around the horn and kind of introduce ourselves and maybe give a little bit of particular color on where we're coming from in terms of these sorts of partnerships. And I'll forecast just our game plan a bit, which is, Jenny and Jason and I, we're going to kind of have a conversation here, share some examples, share some tips. I'm like a quasi host of some sort, but really we're going to ask each other questions. And we're also going to encourage everyone to please ask questions beginning right away. So don't feel like you need to wait towards the end. There's the chat function, the Q&A function that Ryan's put instructions on here. So don't be bashful, start throwing in things. And our hope is that through this mixture of chat amongst us and chat with you, we'll have a bit of a conversation here that we're looking forward to. So with that, maybe I'll come to you first, Jenny, to kick off our Around the Horns, giving a little bit more color on the perspective that you're going to be bringing to talking about starting these types of partnerships.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks, David. Really happy to be doing this with both David and Jason. We're going to use first names throughout this, so you all should do the same. This is one of my favorite topics. So why do government research partnerships? What's hard about it? How you can do it well? So I will just say briefly about my background, and I think then we'll go to Jason and back to David. I am the director of the North Carolina Office of Strategic Partnerships. Everything we do focuses on partnering across sectors. That's most often government and research, but also government and philanthropy, often government and other nonprofits that are not philanthropy. So just have in mind a lot of different types and levels and scopes and lengths and costs and so on of partnerships on many, many different issues. We are not simply looking for partnerships for the sake of bringing people together across sectors, so sometimes we start with that, but we look at where is there an opportunity to bring evidence from maybe outside expertise and experience into government and keep that in government and keep some of those skills building in government. This is my, I think, third tour in government, including a brief stint in federal government and a prior stint in state government. I've been in academia as we were all in sort of connected with or in North Carolina at the moment. So as some would say to Jason, at a school down the street from him, and really appreciate the way in which we will be talking about this from different perspectives. And I will just say quickly, happy to say more about my background if that's helpful, but I'll say quickly just why we landed in this conversation to begin with. I am not a big tweeter. I am on there at times, but it was literally a tweet from Jason that made a reference to the importance of, not to me specifically, but to the world, the importance of understanding the inside of government when you are outside government and working to partner with government. That led me to reach out to him, and we started a conversation and said, well, maybe let's have this conversation publicly in some way and see what we can learn from others and each other about that challenge. So I just wanted to point out this wasn't a random occurrence where somebody asked us to do this, but we saw an opportunity to share some of our discussions and learnings as well as with David for this opportunity. So thanks, David. Back to, or I guess over to continuing around the horn to Jason.
Yeah, thanks, David and Jenny. This is absolutely Jenny's brainchild, and so, but super helpful for no other reason to vent. So I'm Jason Coupe. I'm an associate professor in the School of Public and International Affairs at NC State. If you count grad school, I've been an academic for 10 or 11 years now, and over that span, I probably had a dozen or so between formal and informal like partnerships with government agencies or nonprofits. Typically, there's a research component to it, and I feel like every time I've done it, or most times, someone goes, "Man, this was refreshing. You're not like a typical academic," which I think, oh my God, what's wrong with my colleagues, man? Like, why do people complain about us so much? And I have to, after having been an academic long enough, I totally get it. Like, right, like I got to live with these people, right? So like, I get where people are coming from, but I'm super excited about having that discussion from both sides, right? And talking to other engaged faculty. And I make mistakes too all the time. but in talking to other engaged faculty about mistakes they made, but also things that they wish they could see from themselves, but government partners as well, right? Like the sort of things that across the sort of this dichotomy that we've put together, things that we both could do better to improve how these relationships typically go. So super excited to be around for this.
Thanks, Jason. And again, I'm David Yoakum. I direct the policy lab at Brown University and also a senior advisor with Jenny at the Office of Strategic Partnerships. And at the policy lab, we work a lot with the state of Rhode Island, as well as governments across the country, helping complete applied public policy kind of research projects. But I think what we really kind of focus on is doing those projects in a way that elevates the capacity to do this type of work yourself inside of government. And so this is where a lot of emphasis on how to put partnerships in place with researchers, many of whom are in government already, how to get them to collaborate, but also universities or other research centers is its own problem. And as I think you'll get a feel for as we're talking today, there's a lot of pieces to it. And my last little bit of bio I'll say is that before this post, I worked in the mayor's office in the District of Columbia for a while. I worked in the federal government during the Obama years, and in both of those capacities set up scientific teams based inside of government entirely. And before that was at the University of Arizona. So I've kind of had the luxury of being a little bit on the academic fence, a little bit on the government fence, and at the federal level, as well as the state level, as well as whatever level DC is. I don't know how you want to categorize that. So for those of you who trickled in late, welcome again. We're excited to have a convo here. I'll encourage everybody to not be bashful about putting questions into the chat or the Q&A. But otherwise, here's my first question. I'm curious to hear from both Jenny and Jason, and maybe Jason, I'll come to you first. I want to hear about your like very first partnership you had, your very first date. What was it like? Give some of the details on it. What was your first foray into this brave world of partnerships?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think my sort of first big formal one, where I had any sort of role of note, was as a postdoc back home in Chicago, working with the mayor's office and the school district to design and some local universities to design a working relationship, help design a working relationship with some area nonprofits supporting students. And one of it's Chicago, right? So it shouldn't surprise you, but one of the big things that I noticed was just how many political landmines that there can be when working, particularly in sort of robust government arrangements, where as a researcher, you don't know that they're there. And even if you know that they're there, they can be, you don't know where they are. And so it can be sort of difficult without having a lot of institutional context to navigate it. And sometimes there were times in the room where I felt like, if there were 50 people in there and I'm the only academic, for all 49 people knew where the landmines were and I didn't. And it sort of made working with people difficult. I always felt like I was on sort of on eggshells. And I've had some wonderful partnerships. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's always sort of bad, right? But it's just sort of a thing that popped out as a challenge and one that I've been working toward. I always have in the back of my mind now, whenever I'm working, both wherever I am in North Carolina as well. And those are not always sort of bad politics. It's just politics, right? And so you sort of, thinking through that, I think was a defining characteristic for me that changed the way, definitely made me more thoughtful about how and when I engage government partners.
Jenny?
David, do you want to go ahead or you want me to go next?
Feel free.
Okay. First, I think part of what we're doing here is responding and reacting to each other. So I'm just going to react quickly to Jason's use of the word eggshells and say that hearing that being inside government right now, what I want so much when I hear that is to not worry about stepping on eggshells, and maybe even to say, this is an advice for Jason. I'm just saying when I hear that, I want to say, so don't worry about eggshells, but acknowledge that you feel like you're on eggshells. And how can we help you, how inside of government can we help you not feel that way, right? And educate each other and so on about the challenges. So just a quick note about that. We can talk more about that later if that's helpful to folks. The partnership that I would highlight, I have no idea if it was the first one. I'm sure it wasn't the first one, but was actually when I was, so sorry to switch this up here, but at a university setting and working with governments on something called I'm just going to call it the Consolidated Report. And the Consolidated Report is something that the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction issues annually that is a very long, very helpful, extremely detailed report on incidences of, I'm not going to get this exactly right, but violence, suspension, and expulsion in North Carolina's school districts by district and statewide. And again, things may have changed since I last looked at it, so don't hold me to the specifics of it. But the eye-opener for me of that was this was a combination of people who had worked both in and outside of government. It wasn't total lack of knowledge of each other's sectors, but it was the starting point of jumping in too far down the path of the conversation and not asking some basic questions of each other that would help orient each of us to, wait, what's the purpose of this report? Why am I looking at this report? There are a lot of things I don't understand. Doesn't mean the state was doing it in a problematic or unhelpful way. So almost a little bit back to Jason's eggshell comment, I think everyone feeling maybe like we should have known more about each and not feeling comfortable saying, I actually don't know what you're talking about, or I actually don't understand that question, and feeling more comfortable just putting that out there for each other's benefit and knowledge. So I don't think I'll say too much more about the details of the partnership, but it was a combination of a state agency, university partners, and a number of experts within the agency who, again, were very collaborative, very helpful. We wanted to partner, but had some challenges in getting to the sort of first and next steps.
So mine, and then we should just start chatting. I have a follow-up question about the eggshells, but I feel like I violate my own rule by not at least throwing out one example first. But so mine goes further back in time, maybe too far back in time to almost like cheat on this. It actually goes back to high school, the first time I interacted with not directly the legislator, but at the time, this is back in Mississippi where I finished up high school. They were doing this thing where there's like this youth legislator where they were letting high school students field proposals, and like some subset of them would actually be presented to the real legislator, at least in rhetoric, they were going to do this. And my pitch was that school buses should have seatbelts. They don't. Most school buses don't have seatbelts. It's starting to change a little bit now. And the basic argument for why is that the big old cushions on a seat bus actually provide the needed support during a car crash, so apparently more than like a seatbelt does. But my argument was that might be entirely true, but you still got kids literally like captive in a vehicle during their formative years where you should strap in a seatbelt to form the habit. Like forget about the safety, it's about the long-term habit so that when they get in the car, it's there. And my like mock bill made it all the way to the high school governor, and at the final stage of deciding whether they were going to pitch it on further, it got rejected. And it was one of those moments where they were telling me that it was like a good idea and things like that. But what I didn't know then was how to have a little bit more anticipation for the person who was going to be absorbing this information and what they were focusing on. I was coming in just on the merits of how this was going to give a good habit, which I stand by today. But what I didn't know then was to really focus on what this person cared about, which in retrospect was a very strong budget emphasis. They cared a lot about the cost. And so like the missed argument I didn't do was to say how if it led to more seatbelts downstream, we would actually end up saving money in the state because of fewer accidents, insurance costs, and so on. So there's a money argument to be had, but I didn't make it because I was feeling just so good about the core health benefit. So that was my very first one. Well, I do want to come back to this eggshells for a second, and then others, y'all get in here. But Jason, I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about why you feel there's this kind of eggshell sense, what you meant by that tweet that you put out. And then Jenny, I'm going to be curious from you why you think there shouldn't be that eggshell concern, because I think sometimes maybe there are. But Jason, why don't you say a little bit more first?
Yeah, man, no doubt. That seatbelt thing is really interesting. I had a similar experience in high school that I was a little more contentious. But anyway, the eggshell thing, man, it is, I don't mean to say that pejoratively. I think it's more like so within any organization, right, when you're if it's like, all right, when I'm usually brought in, it's like, all right, what is your feedback about, should we do A or B? Or we've decided we're doing B, what's the best way to do B, right? And where I can get tripped up is okay, so if you ask me, should we do A or B? And I had this experience with a nonprofit that drove me nuts. Like, everybody in the organization already knew they were doing A, right? The CEO wanted to do A. They convinced the board to do A. None of the employees wanted to do A. They all wanted to do B. But I was brought in as if this was sort of a choice between A and B, and I should make an argument. And it was super awkward the whole time, because halfway in, I'm like, man, they're doing A anyway. And the whole time I'm engaging the employees, they're complaining about they don't want to do A. The leadership, I don't know why leadership wants to do A, they should do B. And I'm learning, and I'm like, man, I'm not, just wasting my time from an evaluation standpoint, but I'm not being of any assistance to the organization there. And it made my communication tricky, right? Because I'm like, look, I can come in and just say what I'm going to say, but I'm a human being. And so I tried to do that. But in the back of my head, there's always this like, I already know they're going to do A. And now I'm like, they probably shouldn't be doing A, because these other employees, it colored my evaluation and my sentences in a way that made communication awkward. And I think particularly at the time, I was a lot less experienced, like, not that I'm that experienced now, but like, if you aren't as seasoned in handling these, it can be very difficult to have that not color your recommendations, evaluations, and discussion in your role as a partner, right? I think it's sort of easy to say, well, I can just come in, provide my evidence, give a choice, walk away, and they do what they want to do with it, which is often how it works anyway. But still, it makes it an awkward perspective, and I wish that I'm learning to think through sort of how to do that better going forward. Looking out for those. So it's that kind of stuff, right? Like it's sometimes, like I worked on a partnership here for 3 years where we did 3 years of really hard work. Halfway through, they decided they weren't going to do any of this, that the government wanted to move in a different direction. Nobody told me that, and we just were doing that for you. And so it's like, man, that was frustrating, right? A good experience otherwise, but it's those sort of organizational machinations, I think, that outside researchers aren't always privy to, that can make the sort of add some transaction costs to the partner role. Does that make sense?
Well, everyone on the line's not going to answer, and if they are answering, we can't hear them. So hopefully everybody said yes, that makes total sense. But I will say that makes sense. And just to circle back to the eggshells for a quick second, if I probably wasn't clear, I totally think there are eggshells, and I understand why there are eggshells. I just think there are things we can do to mitigate and minimize the eggshells. When I say we, I don't mean Jason should do something differently in academia. It's like really, truly we in a partnership setting. And I think that's a great segue to some really helpful and insightful questions that we already have that I'm glancing at here. So I'm going to take a crack at a couple of them and then again, pass the mic back. So I don't know if people can see each other's names and so on, but we can. So continuing with first names here, Paula asked, what does it mean to partner with government? Is it partnering with an agency or an individual within the agency or both? And then a follow-up related part of that, at the individual level, are there certain roles in government agencies, mayors, governors, and so on, that are more or less likely to show up in these types of partnerships, or that should or should not approach? So I'm going to take the last part first and really try to move quickly through these. And what I guess I'll suggest we do, if it's okay with our sort of moderator, David, let's all speak to Paula's if we want to, and if not, fine. And then let's move to the other two. So I would not say there's anyone you shouldn't approach. Or you never know who the best person is to approach based on a title or a role. I would say don't assume that the highest person, based on what your definition of highest is necessarily the place to start. I prefer to use the word deep in agencies, not low in agencies. So I think that's really important. Often the people who are deeper in the agencies are the ones who may have, or who do have, specific expertise, opportunity to partner, and we'll say second in a minute about what partner means, but having leadership buy into the notion of partnership with other sectors. So with research is really critical, right? So if they're just not on board with that, that could be a hurdle, and happy to talk about how to try to get over that hurdle. Some agencies, and I feel like I have to generalize here because it's impossible to say anything that actually cuts across all levels of government and certainly all states and localities and so on, even within a state. Some agencies, probably more than you might think or than a lot of people would think, have a person who sort of officially or unofficially is a good starting point for inquiring about types of opportunities, whether it's your idea or ideas that they may be seeking support on. And so I would at times consider thinking about the communications people, right? So not necessarily the researcher in the agency or a researcher or an evaluation unit, but somebody who has a bird's eye view of what's going on in that organization. I would also see whatever you can learn about former or existing partnerships, defined in many different ways. What could partnership mean? And then just quickly, because I want to pass the mic here. What does it mean to partner? Great question. And I suppose we could have started with a definition, but probably didn't because there's so many different answers to that question. I'll just offer a few. So back to Jason's comment about, I was working on something for 3 years and didn't know government had switched to doing something else. There are, and in a positive version of that, there are multi-year high cost or low cost or no cost partnerships between research and government, ongoing, maybe without specific deliverables, and I don't mean that in a negative way, where there's simply a back and forth relationship where they consult with each other and benefit from each other's knowledge and expertise on a range of different things. There could also be something that I would also call a partnership, very, very specific, quick turnaround, where, just to use Jason as an example again, Jason's got expertise in a particular type of accounting, let's just say, and we're stuck on something within our agency. Can he spend an hour with me talking on the phone, virtually, whatever it might be, to help me figure out this finance accounting question? And that's the partnership. The important thing I think about something like that is a small, maybe quick turnaround. What feels like a one-off engagement could really be the starting point for something more long lasting. If both, I hate to say sides, but if both sides or groups or entities put some energy into learning more about each other for future engagement. So that's a little bit of each part, I think, of Paula's question. We'll see if David or Jason want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I don't really know exactly how to define partnership either, but what I would maybe offer as something different than, on the one hand, any, council hearings or just like exchanges of information that happen between government and its citizens. Like, there's tons of stuff there. It's important. It's like a partnership in some sense, but it's not exactly at least what I have in mind. There's also tons of just ad hoc relationships that happen. So, I mean, like, it's not uncommon sometimes in these conversations when people be like, oh, like, I don't know, I have partnerships with government all the time. And it's true. You can find like these examples of people that like manage to, by the bootstraps, put a relationship in place. But there's a thicker version still that I think Jason, Jenny, and I, and a number of others are really interested in, which is how to put a little bit more kind of institutional mojo in place to where it's not just reliant on these ad hoc relationships or finding yourself entirely in the right place at the right time for random reasons, but there's instead a kind of a platform for curating in a sort of open way and bringing up to the front these needs for questions that government have that other researchers might be able to answer, and some supports to have those people kind of find each other and get a relationship started where they move through the stages of like trying to figure out how to really define the question, how to actually gather the data for it, how to actually think about it from a more start to finish kind of way, very jointly. And it's like how to institutionalize that. That's the kind of thicker vision of partnerships that I think there's a lot of interesting things happening on right now.
Yeah, no, I think those are great answers. Just combing through the Q&A. Jacqueline has an interesting one too that I'd love to sort of chat about, particularly David and Jenny. Would love to hear your feedback as well. I'm sort of right with her about aligning timelines and expectations. Timelines, expectations, and resources, right? How do you, what kind of steps have you all seen work well? And putting that together and making sure that's on the same page.
So people often lament that the timelines here are different, and they are. Government tends to sometimes work a lot faster, sometimes work a lot slower. Academia is just like generally slow, it feels like. But what I would say here is that the way I've tended to kind of balance this is to remember that there are questions that it might take a long time to fully answer it in a way that an academic would be satisfied with, right? Like there's the question here, you want to run a bunch of experiments, you want to really flesh out the literature. There's a different layer of this where there's a political or a practitioner who needs to make a choice over the next, days or months or whatever the case may be. And you might have information or a perspective that even if it's not that fully baked answer you want, is still going to dramatically increase the knowledge base of the decision maker. And I sometimes think of this as kind of a two-punch of being willing to kind of get in the trenches with a decision maker to share what you can figure out on whatever the timeline is so that they can make a decision, even if it's in a lot of uncertainty. But the second punch, if you can pull it off, is to also try to land a commitment to continue to study the issue so that when that same choice comes around next budget cycle or next legislative cycle, you can answer it better then. And like we did something like this in DC when body cameras were being rolled out by the police department. They had to make some operational choices on how to do that over the course of a few months. And there was a lot of unknowns about that technology. We informed that choice as best as we could. Decisions were made, but we kept studying the program for another year after that. And if you flash forward a year and a half, we ended up knowing a lot more about body cameras, but we were still able to be responsive to an immediate choice in the early parts of that window.
Yeah, so many different great questions and pieces of this to talk about. I think the more, we're talking in part about approaching and starting off strong. And I think with all good intentions, for sure, almost always all good intentions, I have so often been on the receiving end of, in government now, let me know if I can help. And I actually, in this latest sort of tour I'm in now, would say, great, thanks so much. I'll let you know if you can help. And then I realized, no, I'm not. I'm not going to remember that David said that 7.5 months ago. Like, oh, who do I need help now? Who can I call? Oh yeah, this person who maybe, let's just say it's someone I don't have a strong existing sort of partnership and relationship, but is totally meant it. How can I help? And I literally started saying back to people, thank you so much. I know you really mean that. You come tell me when you think you can help. And not in a sort of put you off sort of a way. That was not the point at all. But it was, if you really want to help and you're paying attention to what's going on in government, and I can give some tips. I think we all can probably give some tips, and many of the people on the line can give some tips. How do you know what's going on in government? So it's hard not to crack, but it's not impossible. And it's actually a lot easier than not impossible. What I love is when someone says, I saw last month, last week, yesterday, whatever it is, that the governor or representative so-and-so, whoever it might be, made an announcement about fill in the blank. I've got expertise, not I'm the only person who knows, I don't mean that, but we're working on something that might be helpful to you, or could we meet about it? Not side note, not here's a link to my recent journal article. No offense to folks on the line. I'm not going to click on that link because the amount of work I probably have to do to understand why it's relevant to me and my colleagues is more time than I'm going to take to do that. So I say that completely respectfully because I get many of those, dear Jenny, I'm excited to share my recent journal article, click here. And again, I will go back and say, great, kindly, I hope, why should I care? And more importantly, why should, in the role I'm in now, why should specific agency partners care? But if people come and say, I'm paying attention to what you're doing, and by you, I don't mean me, but government is doing in this agency, administration-wide, whatever it might be, here's how I think I can help. I feel like someone has paid attention to the context, and I think context is just maybe the most important word here, one of the most important words, paid attention to not, let me tell you what I'm really smart about, but here's where what I'm doing connects with what you're doing. Can we have a conversation? I want to take 15 seconds in case the text moves up here and we lose a legislator's question from a minute ago, which I think is relevant to what we're talking about. So thank you. I'm just going to say, Julie, legislator, who's asked a question about whether we think something like this has to be started in the executive branch. I would say very short answer, no. Wonderful. If legislator wants to start something, I would say, again, not to be too much of a broken record here, but if you can do it, and I don't know what the politics are in your certain situation right this minute, if you can do that in partnership with the executive branch, if you're starting something like this, great. But I don't think it has to start in the executive branch.
Yeah, I agree with that. Doesn't have to. Helpful if you can get some appropriations for funding this work is critically needed. And I think we tend to underinvest in the kind of capacity for building this sort of partnership. It's easy to underestimate just how much time it takes to do some of what we're alluding to in terms of like curating questions, helping with relationships. Jenny, I just wanted to like double, triple thumbs up your point about how to actually make recommendations or make yourself available, and just very concretely the tendency for folks to not follow the governor's or mayor's announcements, to be reading legislation, to be knowledgeable about the government around you or whichever one you're trying to inform, understanding their org charts and things like that. To the extent you don't invest in those things, you just continuously miss opportunities to talk about your core area of expertise in a way that is tailored to the decision flows that someone has, not just on the substance, but also the timing. Like there are better and worse times, for instance, in the calendar year to make a suggestion about how budget should be spent, namely when those budget decisions are being, talked about or contemplated. And so invest in just understanding the mechanics of government way more than you perhaps are if you don't feel empowered on how to do that kind of tailoring we're alluding to.
Yeah, same thing, triple thumbs up, particularly the part about context, which I cannot underscore like enough. If you, and I've had to learn to check myself about that, where it's like, you need to engage first, figure out how folks are making decisions. David, like you said, the decision flow, before I think you can really think through, at least in my case, what you can offer up. Unless you're invited as part of this highly structured contract, if this is more organic, it involves a lot of listening and understanding context. Otherwise, all you're really doing or offering to do is add cost to the project, right? Like information is costly to acquire, but also costly to use. So just like if I give you a stack of like, here, I ran all these sort of quasi-experimental designs and you should do A, B, and C, it's still a cost for me to use that. I have to evaluate it. How do I use it? And so if you're not familiar with the context enough to know how to communicate that, where it fits in the decision chart, and to sort of establish the trust, the kind of trust that lowers the cost of them using that information, it can be a frustrating experience. So triple thumbs up on the context part.
Triple thumbs up. I'm going to take the rest of the day off. David, do you want to, excuse me, do you want to add something here?
I'll pick another question.
Okay, so I'm looking at Henry's question, and I think they're coming in both in the chat and the Q&A, so trying to look at both of those. Henry's question about data and the experience of accessing data, and a comment about experience in other countries. And again, someone tell me if everyone can see the questions or if it's just us. So the whole data, and maybe then somebody can speak to Drew Cummings' Drew's IDS question better than I can. The whole question about accessing data is really fascinating in so many ways, and I know perplexing and frustrating for even internal to government, accessing data from ourselves sometimes, just truly, and getting our hands on the good stuff that we have inside of government. I would say, I don't know how well this question, Henry, but even when data are public, not necessarily publicly accessible, but they are intended to be made available for the public or for public use or research use, appropriate use and so on. Often, again, on the receiving end, what we get is something like, I want or I need data, sort of a gentler version of this, but I want or need data for, and usually for is for my paper or for a conference, which is totally fine. But I have gone back to, and I'm thinking of a very specific example in the last year, where I was not the holder of the data, but was more than happy to help someone get it. And when I tried to give the researcher, or not tried to, I gave the researcher an opportunity to speak to why the work that person was going to do might be useful for us inside government. It was pretty much it won't be, that's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it for my conferences and honestly to get tenure into published papers. I 100% get that those are reasons and valid reasons, but with a very small tweaking of the ask or of the thinking about the ask, what I could have received back was, I don't know, but I'd love to talk about it. And maybe there's one question I can add to my interview protocol, or one question or two or three question I add to my survey, or something that won't ditch my research agenda, that won't get me off track on my conferences and papers, but that will be useful to you in government. I guarantee, with so many requests that we get all the time, and I'm speaking more on behalf of my agency partners who literally do these requests and so on, or handle these requests. Yes, they're priorities, but if you're working, if you get 5 questions today and requests for data, and one of them, you can't do them all at once. So even within the priorities, you have to prioritize. And one of them comes in with, here's why this might be helpful to you, or I'm interested in talking about how what I'm doing might be helpful to you. And the other ones are just straight up, how can I get your data? Guess which one we're going to pay most attention to, and have an interest in something that may actually, and not to forget, like, we're working for the public here, right? And so part of the response could be like, what are we going to do that's good for North Carolinians, good for the public in terms of partnering with research? So I hope that made sense and speaks, Henry, a little bit to what it feels like on the receiving end, and maybe a tip or two about how to approach it.
Yeah, and I'd maybe add 2 things on this. One is just to point out that this is a nice example of that kind of like institutional platform I was alluding to earlier, that to the extent we can build data systems and protocols around them to be more efficient, to consider requests and securely share data, the marginal effort to get these sort of requests to share data done gets lower and lower, and we can do more and more of them. But that takes money, that takes legal work. There's a lot of privacy considerations that need to be a community discussion, but I think that's a plank of work to pursue. The second thing I'd say is, while that doesn't exist, which is the case in most places, this is kind of another version of what Jenny was getting at, is don't underestimate how often a data person at an agency is getting these requests for data. I mean, there's a school district that I worked with, for instance, that was a place where kids were like randomized into public or charter schools, and literally every single day for a year, every single day, they got at least 1 up to 3 requests from researchers who wanted the data so they could take advantage of a natural experiment there. And like they fielded the first few of these, and then the things that started to happen were, 1, researchers would take the data and then they wouldn't actually ever come back with what they learned from it, which is just like immediately annoying. But then the second and last thing I'd say here is, and this comes from a good place, often researchers will say like, don't worry, like just give me the data. I'm not going to ask anything else of your time. I'll do everything. And it feels like that's being generous and helpful. But the thing I'd maybe invite you to think about is that the data person on the other side of the agency, like probably why they went there and why they are excited about the work is that they too want to be using the data to answer policy questions. And so this world in which all they do is give the data to someone else and they're not involved in the intellectual work of making sense of it, it actually misses the opportunity for them to get excited about it. It'd be kind of like in a faculty setting, if I were to like come to you and say, hey, I'll do your research and write your papers for you so you can spend all of your time in faculty meetings. Like you wouldn't exactly be excited about that, even though it's saving time. And a lot of data scientists in government feel that way. And again, I think it's coming from a good place from academics, but I'd encourage you to involve them rather than feeling like offloading that work is going to make them happier.
Yeah, 100%. It actually is a nice segue into Drew's question about integrated data systems. And I was involved in designing one of those, or helping to design one in Chicago to sort of eliminate some of these problems where there are data requests and then there's a bureaucratic process to getting that data and there might not be what you want, et cetera, et cetera. But man, those are hard too, because data often can and should be protected. It reminds me of one of Trevor Brown and Matt Petoskey and Dave Van Slyke's paper about, the sort of perfunctory behavior, or we can sort of expect things out of the other because we're integrated that may not be integrated well. Those are tough. The rules around there are can be hard. It's costly. I think it's costly in general. For sure. I don't really have a good answer, but I wanted to float that out as something that to be thought about as well. Thanks, Drew.
Jenny, I'm curious your take on question that Hazel just asked. She's working on a project, academic publishing
Publisher,
project,
yeah.
to make more policy, make more work
Mhm.
in a policy brief format, and whether that would be. I'm actually curious your take on how helpful that would be.
Yeah, I was looking at that question. It's a great, first of all, thanks for asking. Seriously, I mean, that's not a question that every academic publisher asks, so maybe you think about it. I think it could be helpful. My first reaction was, yes, please do that. And then as David was maybe reading my mind, well, maybe, but what I don't think we need is lots more written material in less than accessible or not timely ways. And so I would say yes with some, I don't want to say conditions, I don't mean that sounds too strong, but yes, it would be wonderful with certain parameters maybe, or considerations, context really, again. And I do also think that where you're sitting as an academic publisher is not irrelevant, and maybe highly relevant, partly in terms of, on one hand, I feel very strongly that a lot of this has to include internal to government engagement. So it can't all be done outside and then let's come sort of show you what we did for you, government, but do it again in partnership. On the other hand, you are, Hazel, as an academic publisher, you sit in a place where people in academia are listening and paying attention to what you're doing for a lot of good reasons. And so if I'm thinking about, well, maybe we could partner on this in all seriousness and try something here. I don't know well enough about when this has been tried. So sorry, rambling answer here. Thanks for people's patience and an off the cuff consideration. But so again, short answer, yes, I think it could be extremely helpful if it were done thoughtfully and literally figuring out how to do what you just described in partnership with government before just running out and trying it. So thanks for asking.
Yeah, that's cool. So I'm torn on this one just because there is so much stuff already written. And maybe this is just going a little further on what you were alluding to on like the parameters of it, like more plain language synthesis of research papers. I mean, there I would just say like we should be just writing fewer inscrutable research papers and just make those more plain language to begin with. But I think versions of handouts that are more like syntheses of a number of different studies and like some kind of like grid way, or another version of this I've sometimes thought of is, is there a synthesis of like 20 ideas that every director of a Department of Transportation should be considering right now, that has just like a pretty compelling list of a bunch of ideas with some places to go for further information, and maybe couple that with an offer for like a 15-minute call with an expert on that area. And the importance of that call is that often where the breakdown happens, it's not just that something wasn't in plain language, it's that the context in a particular government, they've got like half the budget in a different political setting than whatever happened in the original study. And so what's really wanted is a conversation about like, will this still work if I slash the budget in half, if I can only do it over 6 months rather than 8 months? And like no more recycling of more and more plain language statements is going to help you with that. You kind of need a little bit of a dialogue with the expert who can make some projections on how they think it'll generalize in that slightly different setting.
That's a great question. That, from the academic publisher angle is really interesting. I know within our MPA program, I for sure and a couple of other folks are starting to much more explicitly sort of train our MPA students to be able to distill that kind of research into these digestible memos for when they're asked, right? So it was nice about having it at that angle when they're interning or working at the budget office or whatever, and they're saying, hey, I got to make a decision tomorrow. And we actually got this feedback from the state that this was valuable. I got to make a decision tomorrow. We're voting on this budget. If we can spend blank, what should I expect would happen? And to tinker around with the data, we'll be able to distill it into 2 or 3 very clean paragraphs with clear headings that sort of provide guidance about what the data says. And I hadn't thought about it from the publisher angle for sure, but I know that there's demand for that kind of information from for our students and interns from government.
I want to add one thing that I think speaks to a few of the questions in here about timing, and also want to go back to a question about asking for data when there might be a political landmine involved. Don't want as much as I'd like to avoid that question, I'm not going to, but for the the question that, just feeding off of what Jason was saying, and you had a phrase in there, Jason, about sort of when asked, or a version of that, sorry, I don't remember exactly. And David said something too about the timing. For all the differences between academia and government and other research institutions, not just straight up academic institutions, but the timing, the way things are presented, the incentives for success, the training, generally speaking, and experiences, there are ways to get better educated and make it less of a black box, I think, for people who have not worked inside either realm, to learn about it more. And in the context for today, we're talking about research approaching government more than the reverse. So of course, both are critical to work on doing well. And very sort of a couple of very basic, I guess, tips I would offer is, if you're not, think of your domain, whether you're in a local, state, federal, or whatever your area of interest is, both topically and level of government. If you're not getting the press releases from your local county health department, if you're a health person, and your state health person, if you're a health person, or whatever it might be, you have to be getting those press releases. And I say that kindly, try to say that kindly, but that is where announcements are made about money coming in. Think about American Rescue Plan funds right now. Everybody's trying to understand the funding for American Rescue Plan. There's a lot of information at all level is putting out as quickly as we can, based on guidance from Treasury and so on, about money coming in. And that's just one example, obviously not a normal one or a typical one. But get on press release lists for those agencies if you're not sure how to find out what that agency head or governor or legislator, I know there's a legislator on the line, so I hope you agree with this, what we care about and when we care about it, or what they care about and when they care about it. That's a really good tip to say, oh, that article I published 7 months ago that nobody responded to, nobody seemed to care, all of a sudden that window seems to be open where they're talking about just what it is I'm an expert on and wrote about. Maybe now is the time to share that with not the article, but pieces of the article or takeaways from the article, with people inside government that might be interested and find it relevant to the work they're doing right now. I feel like Jason and David might want to chime in there. So let me stop, and then at some point we can get back to the data landmine politics question.
No, I think that's right. The other thing to add to that was worked well for me, and there are costs to it because most I get tenure and all that. But so you do have to be choicey. But to me, I found that I've been able to work on more relevant things and I've had better timing when I'm seen as working alongside whoever's working in that space, as opposed to trying to sort of inject a shock of research from outside, right? Like that sort of improves my timing. And so I was working on a child welfare project for 2 or 3 years. I'm not really a child welfare person, but I evaluate organizations. And so I spent a year going to child welfare advocacy meetings, right? Learning a lot about who was in the room, who does what partners are, how the policy is changing, what's on the table, what might happen a year from now. And it made me, A, learn the context well and avoid some of those landmines, but B, have better timing about when I'm chiming stuff in, when I'm bringing in what could be most useful, what I'm bringing in that's most useful, right? Sort of to what data may be applicable and what conversation or relationship improves at what time. So I think sort of working alongside and sort of spending that time, particularly if it's that space you really care about, cultivating those relationships and getting to understand that policy context, I find improves timing.
I think it's really important to respond to the person who asked about a first-time researcher, because you are really important. Everybody's really important on this call, but really to hear that. So one, I would hang out with people like Jason and David. I mean that seriously. So find, and I don't know where you are, obviously, literally, or in what phase of and what type of institution. But whether you're in academia or government or something else, find a person or people who already care about what we're talking about right now. Like, don't try to, eventually try to convince people, but for starters, find somebody who does this work. Look to see who's on this call at some point. Maybe we can sort of reveal that and I'll know who was on this call, and look who might be in your neck of the woods geographically, and get to know them. if you're saying by first time researcher, I want to partner with government, there was a comment somewhere, somebody was saying, a reference to being really senior, or Jason, it was you who said something about you when you were junior. I don't think somebody, and I think you agree, I don't think being senior at all is a prerequisite to doing this work well. In fact, I think sometimes it's not so helpful necessarily, or it's certainly not more helpful. With the exception for sure that if you're in academia and you have tenure, yes, you have time freed up to do this sort of thing. And I totally appreciate that. And that's not a pretend thing. I mean, I know that's real. But in terms of an openness of, I think, of government people, I mean, again, mean this kindly, I don't say we don't care what your level is, but we care a lot less than I think people in academia think we might care. I think other people think we should care maybe. And so it is really back to what questions you're asking. The word we used in setting up this session was approach. Like, what is your approach? It can't be all about you. It can be partly about you, and being in tune with as much as possible with what your partner entity or sector, so in this case, government, cares about as well. So I really think, I don't want to oversimplify how hard this is in some ways. And really one note I made to myself during this discussion is like, this takes time. So when Jason says he did all that stuff he did and went to, I think he said child welfare meetings, like, I don't know where he found the time to do that. It doesn't just come with the job. And so there is a commitment people have to make if you care about doing this kind of institutional engagement, that I know academic institutions don't say like, oh, and by the way, new professor, we're going to give you a day a week to go hang out in government settings. Often that's actually not supported. So I would just say a few things about find people who do it already, and start small, start very, very small. You do not have to start with a multi-year, high level of funding project. So hope that's helpful.
Go local too. Don't think you got to jump to doing like a White House advisory council or something like that. Your local Department of Public Works who needs help with just some descriptive stats on a data set might be very simple for you to do, but I would submit to you could be tremendously helpful for the department and be an on-ramp into just learning about government that you can build on. So that's a simple local, be a little promiscuous on what you're willing to work on, and don't underestimate how basic stats and stuff like that can help folks.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I literally had an MPA student in my class learn how to do a regression, took that to a small town in North Carolina, ran one on like something super simple, and they like promoted him a director. Like it was so tremendously helpful in that context. And also another thumbs up to what Jenny was saying about finding other people when you knew. That's not just sort of new in terms of tenure, but new to an area, like either geographically or sort of from a policy sense. I have a relationship in state transportation now that is really robust. But when I first started, I was working on transportation back in Illinois, and I thought it was really a passion of mine. I like what I was doing. It took me 3 years of going to meetings, getting to know people, and finding I found a great partner at NC State that works with them all the time to say, go to this, don't go to that, talk to this person. This person has the same title, but kind of works on this other thing. It's those things that I think reduce the cost of not that the agency bears, but of you. A lot of the sort of inexperiences that, at least for me, I didn't know what I was doing, right? And so partnering with other people, I think reduces the cost, just sort of makes it more efficient, particularly those who are pre-tenure. And not that you don't have a ton of constraints post-tenure too, you do, but like you have maybe a little more choice about how you allocate your time. But pre-tenure, to reduce some of those costs, you really should get to know the people and the folks in that domain that make it a little bit easier to instead of banging your head against the wall.
And super fast, because I see your follow-up question about like, do I just email someone? You can. The thing I would inject additionally, though, particularly as the pandemic's listening, we're getting back in person, is the value of like being present at local government events. Whatever they do, open houses, council hearings, like physically go introduce yourself to folks that you make a bit of a human connection. That can be something that takes time. Like maybe you need to do it a lot, but if you're like around more, you'll become a bit of a known entity that'll increase the odds that someone pays attention to that email. So we end up one, right?
I think we need APPAM powers to come tell us if we're about to wrap up, I think.
That went fast.
Yeah, I think we're coming to the end here. And so maybe, I don't know the elegant way to close this out, maybe another around the horn with any final thoughts you have or advice for folks that are trying to get started or go deeper here. Jenny, can I put you on the spot to go first?
I was about to suggest otherwise, but sure. I guess first I would say thanks for the, I mean this seriously, like thanks for the interest. Just to know that this many folks, I don't know how many people are on the line, but that there's a lot of interest in this is really encouraging to me. I think there are a lot more people who spend time on this than we all might realize collectively. I would say not to be cavalier about it, but try something. And really back to Jay, like what led me to reach out to Jason was how much I really appreciate about Jason and David, but Jason's very specific comment about not really understanding what was going on inside and the importance of working to understand what's going on inside.
Uh-oh. I think you might be frozen, Jenny.
Jenny, we lost you.
Jason, that might be your cue to go next.
That freeze picture is hilarious. But no, I agree with that. I think, and this is cliche, but I've heard it enough that it probably bears repeating. Like the best way to do this, in my opinion, is working alongside, right, and not like at, right. Like I'm sort of uncomfortable with the sort of expert coming in, unless it's like for design or whatever. But even then, there's so much of the institutional context is about shared expertise. I mean, as researchers, we don't always really understand what's going on enough. And even if you're designing a really robust set of experiments, for instance, that requires a ton of institutional knowledge, right? You kind of got to know what parts are moving so that you can design it in a way where they're not moving, you get better information. So I would say sort of it's spending time working alongside, like David was saying, sort of showing up, being present, and as a member of that space, and less as a sort of proposed outside expert. I think if that makes sense. So,
and I'll just close it out by saying, I think probably on behalf of all of us to stay in touch. Sign up for the listservs of the organizations that we work in. Listen to the podcast. Shoot an email. Would love to talk to anybody if you're interested in this. And I'd end you with the thought that this type of work is incredibly exciting and rewarding. And so I think as you get into it or you go deeper into it, you'll find a lot to like about it. But the level set, it is hard, right? So get your mind right that, the first times you swing at this, don't expect that the first email you send is going to lead to a multi-year RCT or anything like that. You're probably going to have a quite low hit rate at first. And so just absorb, learn from it. And over time, you'll get better and better. With that, we are officially at the 1 o'clock strike. We are done. Jason, Jenny, it's great to see you guys as always. And thanks for everybody in the audience. It's been a lot of fun. We'll see y'all later.
thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you all, enjoyed it.